You either use the internet for fun or you use the internet to grow. You're here to grow. Welcome to TRS Clips. Very young person perspective here. A lot of people my age and younger only understand the Kashmir problem a little bit from news and nowadays from Twitter and this whole Kashmir Files movie that released and all the hype that was around it. I'm sorry I'm taking it to the world of movies now. But again, this is how I have to commercially connect with the audience. Have you watched the film?
Yes.
Did you think it was an accurate depiction of what happened?
Not really.
It wasn't. Okay? We're going to break down that thought entirely. I want to understand what the truth is, and only men like yourself who've actually been there have a right to speak about the truth. I want to again begin in a slightly morbid place, so I apologize. But what was the most psychologically difficult thing you saw? And I ask you that for you to set a bar in terms of intensity and then explain the context, if you're comfortable to do so.
Okay. One of the most, I think this is in context with the question you asked with regard to Kashmir Files, why it's not an accurate depiction. What happened with the Kashmiri Pandits is a very sordid story, and there's no denying that. But why I said it's not an accurate description is because the vilification of the Kashmiri Muslim is not justified.
Okay.
And I'll give this to you because it connects with exactly one of the most horrifying incidents that I have seen. I was what they call the subdivisional police officer in Srinagar town. And the heart of that jurisdiction is Kothi Bagh. And I was sitting in front of the women's college and this huge explosion took place. And from the distance of the sound I could make out it had happened in my jurisdiction. And I drove to the place and what I saw was a completely abandoned street, which is called Nai Sadak, which must have been Nai at one point, but this was part of the old town now. And there was a piece of pulsating meat, I would say, in the middle of the road. There were small shreds of flesh and blood splattered across the street and on the shutters of the shops alongside. I saw one thigh of a human being lying in one gutter and one arm lying in another gutter. And I remember there was a crow that picked up a hand and it was too heavy for it to carry, so it dropped it near me. And this thing was still pulsating, and I immediately understood who the person was. This was an inspector of BSF by the name of Akbar, who was a Kashmiri Muslim. He had been caught by what was called the Al-Umar Mujahideen, and they had tied a bomb around him and blown him up in the middle of the street. So when I picked up his dead body, I remember my PSOs came with me and we could barely walk there because, the boots were sticking to the ground.
By dead body, you mean just...
Whatever that was left of the upper torso. The rest of it had been blown up. So we picked up that arm, that leg, and that hand. And the sweater was over his face. When I pulled the sweater, then I saw his face. And such was the whole scene that my PSOs were completely transfixed. They didn't know what to do. So then I asked, I said, get some cloth, sheet, sack, whatever you can, to where we can put this remnants of this body in. And there was nothing to lift it with. So I actually picked up the dead body from its hair and put it into the sack and put the leg and the arm and everything because we wanted to get it off the streets. It is a very, very disturbing scene. And then the father of the inspector came. And I looked at him and I saw he was completely stoic. No emotions on his face. He just looked at the sack and he said, "Is this him?" I said, "Yes, that's what is left over." He said, "ठीक है, आप गाड़ी में रख दीजिए." So I put it in the vehicle, he took it. We got the fire brigade and washed the street and all that to just kind of normalize the whole thing. Why I made this incident was that it is not that the Kashmiri Muslim did not sacrifice for the Indian cause in Kashmir. That's the point of it.
Okay. Like you can't just categorize every single Kashmiri Muslim as someone who was against...
The mainstay of the movement against terrorism in J&K today is the Jammu and Kashmir police, which is almost 70% Muslim.
Okay. This is what people need to know.
This is what they need to know.
Okay. Appreciate you saying that on my podcast. And this is the reason we started this podcast. I don't feel like modern day television can get the truth out, can get nuggets of truth out like this. Did you have a conversation with his father after?
No, I didn't have a conversation with his father after that.
What was in your mind?
What was in my mind was the acceptance of that old man when he saw his son. He must have been as old as I am today, with a son who's of a similar age. I was trying to think what was going through the heart and mind of this man who's picking up his child in this form. And I was also thinking about, look at the choice that this man must have had to make. Because at that time, Kashmir was in a state of virtual revolt. There was a vast minority which had picked up arms against the state. But the vast majority was actually not really involved. But you see, there is always what they call the tyranny of the minority. That a very large vocal minority can actually suppress a very moderate, reasonable majority. That's why, they say that tyranny actually survives on the silence of the majority. So it's a very typical case in cases of terrorism also.
Now, while we are breaking down this truth of Kashmir Files section, in no way are we defending the atrocities committed. Like, I want to make that clear. This is just a podcaster's rule of
as
the
I
book.
said, that what happened with the Kashmiri Pandits is a very horrific incident. And there's no doubt that the people who perpetrated it had it in mind to do a ethnic cleansing. Unfortunately, even the people who were pretending to be secular, which is the JKLF people, they also indulged in it, and it was on a religious line, no doubt about it. But the fact is that then if you look at the figures of people who died in the valley, the number of Pandits killed is very small compared to the very large number of Kashmiri Muslims who died. And most of them were killed by the terrorists.
Okay.
So obviously, it's not that the entire population was with them.
Okay.
So you see, there were big factors, like people who are in the administration. They were not with terrorism. People who were in the administration and the police whose families were not with terrorism. There were political parties. There was the Congress, there was National Conference. Later on, of course, you had the PDP, but when this was happening, PDP didn't exist. But these parties had large followings. It's not that the elections didn't have people voting in it. So there was a general acceptance of the Indian state also. It's not that it is only that there was separatism. That's why I said the vast majority was there, but it was silent. So like when we went into the valley, the major political leaders had all moved out.
When you saw the movie last year, whenever it released, what was your first thought?
First, I didn't want to see it.
Why?
Because I knew it would be all unrealistic portrayal of whatever, because I was seeing the conversations around it. Then I actually met some Kashmiri Pandits who didn't like the film at all. And they said this is a disservice to our community.
Really?
He said it has been done by Kashmiri Pandits and encouraged by that element, which is never going to go back to Kashmir. But those of us who are going to go back to Kashmir will never find acceptance in Kashmir after this has happened.
Because it has painted...
It has vilified the entire Muslim community. So, I mean, when you are talking about entire generations, there is an entire generation of Kashmiri Pandits who also do not connect with the valley anymore. So, somebody who was born in the 80s who had to flee the valley and has now settled in other parts of the country is getting into his 40s now. So that child is not really interested in going back, or that young man is not interested in going back because he's built a life around it. And they have done very well, because the Kashmiri Pandit community is a very evolved community. They study hard, they work hard, and more or less it's a civilizational issue. They have capacities of thinking. Their women are also very well educated. So the family has a very good culture. So therefore, I mean, why would they want to go back to the valley? But there are many of them who are nostalgic and want to go back to the valley. And it is impossible to settle people if the vast majority do not accept you. Even if they don't come and kill you and they just don't accept you, you will find it difficult. Because
you're saying that the movie showed a tiny portion of Kashmiri Muslims doing...
No. The tiny portion of the Muslims were doing what they did.
Yeah.
But in the movie they portrayed that everybody has done it.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's the idea that I was trying
Yeah,
to
because
encapsulate.
for example, like buying the house and then betraying the Pandit child when he comes back, and all that story, and then it was. I mean, rather poor. I think what happened to them was terrible.
Yeah.
And I've been witness to some of the incidents myself.
Before we get to it, do you want to draw out some of the positives of the movie so people understand that we're just trying to break it down? As a podcaster, I'm always supposed to just extract information.
No, but I mean, we can give a balanced view to that.
What is, you give me the balance.
See, in the fact is that the story of the Kashmiri Pandit needed to be brought out. Somebody had to speak about what happened to them, how they were treated. And I think the biggest problem that the Pandit faced was that he was given no empathy. They were not a poor community. They were a fairly prosperous community. They were suddenly overnight you are uprooted and dumped into this, I would not even call it a tent. And I would say it was like a juggi. So you have been dumped into that in a sweltering heat when you come from an extremely nice area where the weather has always been good. The place was beautiful. Here you come into a dusty, warm place you're not accustomed to at all. And you're completely uprooted. Your life is like completely at sea. So that was a terrible story.
Okay.
The fact that it got recognition so late is also a big misfortune. But I think it could have been done in a much nicer way, where the tragedy of it could have been brought out, because every Kashmiri Muslim did not want this to happen. In fact, I would say most of them did not want this to happen. When I went there, most of them would regret what happened. They were very sorrowful. Large number of them wanted to blame Jagmohan for allowing it to happen. And at a personal level, I do feel that the state failed. The primary duty of the state is to protect the lives and properties of their citizens. So at that time, the state should have stood up for the Pandit. There were plenty of forces. After all, you pumped in a huge number of forces. You could have created a situation where you could have protected some of them. There would have been attrition. It's not that you could have ensured that everybody lived. But at least you could have contained the sense of fear.
How?
One was that the Pandits largely lived in localities. So you could actually, protect those localities. You could like you have gated colonies today. You could have created a gated colony and protected them there.
Okay. And there's a bunch of more strategies like this, which as a cop, because you've practically done it in your own career. And you're saying at that time, they could have just green lighted these strategies, which definitely would have been pitched by someone.
See, the general belief is that, a lot of people blame Jagmohan for allowing this migration to take place. In fact, they say that he facilitated it by providing trucks and all from the army and from the paramilitary to move the Pandits out, which is also not untrue. That is the point.
You'll have to give full context here. There's people who don't know who Jagmohan is, the story. See,
Jagmohan, who was the governor of Jammu and Kashmir at that time, and Jagmohan had a fairly checkered past. Jagmohan was infamous for the Turkman Gate firings during the emergency period in Old Delhi. Then he went on to become governor of J&K around the early 80s, when he was actually responsible for dismissing Farooq's government, which is actually the trigger to what is currently happening. And he was again sent back. He came back and then he was again sent back in 90. So in 1990, Farooq Abdullah resigned as chief minister and the government suddenly disappeared. The movement was already on. You had lakhs of people hitting the roads. Jagmohan came in and to a very desperate situation. And he then gave a free run. There were a lot of mass killings in the processions that took place. But alongside this also happened. So it was not that the use of force was anyway limited, or that there weren't sufficient forces to deal with the situation. But you should have prioritized this instead of just allowing them to run. And I think that made a very sad commentary on us. So, whereas when you're willing to vilify the Kashmiri Muslims, you should also accept that this also happened.
That vilify the administration as well.
Well, I mean, I think that the people who took decisions at that time need to be held responsible for allowing this to happen.
How did they feel about it in the years that followed, according to you?
See, then the Kashmiri Pandit card became a card. So, but I mean, it was a terrible story, and I think the international community needed to know that what had happened to them.
Okay. You know that lots of people are going to get to know it through this podcast. Like, they're not going to watch the Kashmir Files. There's going to be a segment that will just listen to this podcast, which is why I'm asking you such, for a lack of a better word, intense or edgy questions. I want like the full truth.
No, I think, see, the thing is that a subject has to be given its right treatment.
Okay.
It should not get become a tool for a narrative.
Yeah.
So let the story be true. I mean, as I said, that the Pandits, had a terrible time, but the reasons were very, very different. So films like Kashmir Files and all will again try to vilify a Kashmiri Muslim administration for allowing this to happen. No doubt there was failure on the part of the popular government at that time, but the migration largely took place under the governor's rule.
New clips released at the same time that a podcast releases. This is TRS Clips. Make sure you subscribe.